In the summer of 1966, an American motorcycle dealer in Southern California opened a bulletin that turned his showroom into a museum. Associated Motorcycles, the British parent company of AJS, had financially collapsed. At the ports, crates of imported replacement parts were frozen in receivership. Future factory shipments were canceled. The heavy, torquey AJS singles sitting on American dealership floors instantly became orphaned machines. For the American rider who needed a simple clutch cable to race on Sunday, the supply chain vanished. Mechanics could no longer guarantee repairs. Dealerships were forced to push legendary British engineering to the back of the service bay. The paradox was absolute. The AJS 7R was a world championship chassis, renowned for its track-proven handling. The engine still made power. The badge still carried prestige, but the business system around them had failed. But the real story of AJS in America is not the story of a sudden bankruptcy. It is the story of a racing giant that forgot how to build a motorcycle for the everyday road. Every week, we tell the stories of the motorcycles, engines, factories, dealerships, and roads that once defined the American market, and what happened when the industry moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, on an American dirt track, in the years just after the Second World War. In the years immediately following the Second World War, the American motorcycle market was defined by heavy iron and long distances. If an American rider walked into a traditional domestic dealership in 1946, they were looking at machines built for highway stability and low-speed pulling power. The American V-twin engine, a two-cylinder engine with the cylinders arranged in a V-shape around a shared crankshaft, was an engineering solution specifically designed to pull a heavy motorcycle, a passenger, and often a sidecar away from a city curb or across a sprawling interstate. But a distinct cultural shift was happening far from the paved roads of the Midwest. In the sweeping deserts of Southern California, and on the dirt oval tracks scattered across the country, young riders, many of them returning military veterans, were stripping heavy fenders and headlights off Harley-Davidson and Indian motorcycles to race them in the dirt. These domestic machines were exceptionally durable, but they routinely weighed well over 500 pounds. When a rider entered a grueling desert scramble like the Big Bear Run, wrestling a massive V-twin through deep sand and rocky inclines was an exhausting test of brute physical strength. The American off-road racing scene was accelerating rapidly, but the domestic manufacturing system had not yet built a dedicated lightweight racing machine to meet the demand. The market was starved for a motorcycle that could deliver reliable power while weighing less than 350 pounds. That mechanical void would not be filled by a factory in Milwaukee or Springfield. It would be answered by a struggling industrial conglomerate located on the other side of the Atlantic. The letters on the fuel tank stood for Albert John Stevens. Founded in Wolverhampton, England in 1909, AJS began as a family operation dedicated to building the single-cylinder engine, an engine with one cylinder and one piston, producing all combustion power. The Stevens brothers did not build motorcycles for casual suburban commuting. They built them to win the Isle of Man Tourist Trophy, the most dangerous and prestigious motorcycle road race in the world. For 2 decades, AJS earned a fierce reputation for precision engineering and track-proven reliability. But racing success did not guarantee financial survival. During the economic collapse of the Great Depression, the original AJS company went bankrupt. In 1931, the brand name and manufacturing rights were purchased by the Collier brothers, the owners of the rival Matchless Motorcycle Company. They moved all AJS production away from Wolverhampton and directly into the Matchless factory on Plumstead Road in London, forming a new corporate entity called Associated Motorcycles, or AMC. Inside the Plumstead factory, a practice known as badge engineering took hold. An AJS motorcycle and a Matchless motorcycle rolling down the exact same assembly line were often identical machines. They shared the same frame, the same engine castings, and the same suspension components. The only physical difference between them was the paint color, the exhaust routing, and the metal badge bolted to the fuel tank. However, AMC management made a strategic decision to position AJS as the corporation's premier racing mark. While Matchless would target the everyday road rider, AJS would carry the company's engineering pride onto the global racing stage. That racing focus materialized brilliantly in 1948 with the introduction of the AJS 7R. Known inside this factory and around the world as the Boy Racer, it was a specialized machine built strictly to dominate the 350 cc racing class. The 7R was powered by an overhead cam engine, an engine with the camshaft placed in or above the cylinder head, closer to the valves, allowing the engine to rev higher and produce more power than traditional designs. The engine cases were cast from lightweight magnesium. The frame was a rigid, heavily triangulated steel structure that held the engine tightly in alignment, providing absolute stability in high-speed corners. When independent American distributors began looking overseas for lighter, faster motorcycles to import, they immediately recognized the value of the AJS singles. Because AMC did not have a massive corporate-owned dealership network in the United States, AJS relied on passionate, independent shop owners. Distributors like Frank Cooper on the West Coast set up independent importation networks, entirely bypassing traditional domestic supply chains. Crates of British motorcycles began arriving at American ports. When an American flat-track racer or desert scrambler opened one of those wooden shipping crates, they found a machine that looked entirely foreign. An AJS motorcycle, painted in its signature black and gold, was narrow, mechanically compact, and aggressively stripped of all unnecessary mass. The arrival of AJS in American showrooms fundamentally changed the geometry of American racing. A rider could purchase an AJS 350cc or 500cc single, take it directly to a local dirt track on a Sunday, and immediately outmaneuver heavier domestic machinery. The single-cylinder engine provided a distinct, rhythmic traction on loose dirt, digging into the track rather than spinning the rear tire helplessly. In the sprawling deserts of Southern California, the AJS scramblers proved durable enough to survive hours of high-speed abuse over rocks and sand, while being light enough that a fatigued rider could actually pick the motorcycle up after a crash. The Amal carburetor, a mechanical device that mixes gasoline and air before the mixture enters the engine, was simple enough for an American privateer racer to tune in the dirt with a single screwdriver. The AJS also featured advanced hydraulic front forks, the front structure holding the front wheel and allowing it to steer and move with suspension travel, which absorbed punishing desert terrain far better than the rigid or girder front ends found on older American machines. Dealerships that stocked AJS models quickly discovered they were not just selling a motorcycle, they were selling a competitive advantage. The heavy American V-twin was no longer the only way to win a race, and independent American parts counters began stocking British Whitworth wrenches right alongside domestic tools. These small storefronts in California, Texas, and the Midwest catered entirely to performance and handling rather than highway touring. The British machine had found its American rider. The market had not yet revealed its price. The breakthrough of AJS in the American market did not happen because of a clever advertising campaign from London. It happened because the motorcycle physically solved a problem that domestic manufacturers had refused to acknowledge. In the early 1950s, the American off-road racing calendar was dominated by grueling endurance events like the Big Bear Run in Southern California. The domestic machines entered in these races were virtually indestructible, but their extreme weight punished the people riding them. When an American rider took a traditional, rigid-frame domestic V-twin into the desert, every rock, rut, and dry wash transferred violence directly into the rider's spine. To solve this, AJS employed a modern swing arm, the hinged rear structure that lets the rear wheel move with the suspension. Over a 100-mile desert course, This engineering choice was not a luxury, it was a mechanism for physical survival. While a rider on a rigid Harley-Davidson or Indian was forced to roll off the throttle to keep the rear tire from bouncing wildly off the ground, the AJS suspension allowed the rear wheel to track the uneven terrain. The rear tire stayed planted, maintaining constant forward drive. The physical toll on the rider was drastically reduced, allowing them to ride aggressively for hours, while their competitors on heavier machines simply collapsed from exhaustion. The heart of this competitive advantage was the British single-cylinder power delivery. A large displacement single did not spin the rear tire with a frantic rush of peak horsepower. Instead, it produced deep, rhythmic pulses of torque. The twisting force an engine sends toward the transmission and rear wheel. During the famous Catalina Grand Prix, a spectacular race held on an island off the coast of California, the terrain shifted violently from paved streets to deep, loose dirt. An AJS 500cc engine dug into that earth like a tractor, finding mechanical traction where higher revving engines simply spun their rear wheels and lost momentum. That power was managed through a highly accessible final drive. The AJS utilized a traditional chain drive, a metal roller chain transferring power to the rear wheel through toothed sprockets. While some touring riders found chain maintenance tedious, for an American racer, it was a profound advantage. A mechanic in the dusty pits of Ascot Park could remove the rear wheel and swap the sprocket in a matter of minutes, completely changing the motorcycle's gearing to suit a tight dirt oval or a wide-open desert flat. The machine could be perfectly adapted to the specific American geography it was facing that weekend. This mechanical superiority came at a distinct price. In the mid-1950s, an AJS competition machine or a top-tier scrambler could cost well over $800 on a dealership floor. It was a premium figure for a working-class rider, but it represented a ready-to-race package out of the wooden crate. To make a domestic V-twin competitive in the same lightweight class, an American rider had to spend hundreds of additional dollars cutting the steel frame, stripping heavy fenders, and modifying the engine. Furthermore, domestic factories were still relying heavily on the side valve engine, an engine with the intake and exhaust valves located beside the cylinder rather than above it. The side valve design was historically reliable, but it could not flow air and fuel efficiently enough to match the high RPM breathing capability of the overhead valve British imports. The American motorcycling press quickly recognized this irreversible shift. Publications like Cycle magazine began testing these British singles, praising their lightweight agility, precise steering geometry, and power-to-weight ratios. On the smooth, hard-packed dirt oval of Ascot Park in Los Angeles, the specialized AJS 7R became a lethal weapon in the hands of American privateers. The 7R utilized massive conical magnesium drum brakes, a brake in which shoes press outward against the inside of a rotating drum. When diving into a high-speed corner at Ascot, an AJS rider could wait fractions of a second longer to apply the brakes than a competitor on a heavier American machine, carrying more speed deep into the turn and accelerating out with the immediate punch of a lightweight single. Independent distributors like Cooper Motors in Los Angeles became the vital arteries for this invasion, pushing AJS machines into local California dealerships and eventually across the country. Rivals could not easily copy what AJS was doing. The American factories in Milwaukee and Springfield were heavily invested in the tooling and foundry equipment required to cast massive iron cylinders and heavy steel frames. Retooling an entire American factory to cast lightweight magnesium engine cases and build precision single-cylinder racing machines would have cost millions of dollars and disrupted their core, profitable highway cruiser business. The American rider moat was officially established. If a rider wanted to win in the dirt, they did not wait for a domestic factory to build a lighter motorcycle. They bought a British one. Dealerships that once proudly displayed only domestic iron found themselves clearing showroom space for the black and gold fuel tanks of AJS and its corporate sibling, Matchless. The machines were mechanically honest, visually striking, and completely dominant in their specific performance envelope. They had reshaped the baseline expectations of American performance. AJS had proven it could conquer American dirt and asphalt. But racing victories alone could not sustain a dealer network. By the late 1950s, the independent distribution network for Associated Motorcycles had transformed AJS from a niche British import into a dominant force in American motorcycle racing. Frank Cooper's West Coast operation and other regional distributors successfully pushed the black and gold machines into small-town dealerships and specialized speed shops across the United States. A showroom floor in California or Texas that had previously been dedicated exclusively to heavy domestic cruisers now featured a dedicated space for the British singles. When a customer walked into one of these dealerships, they were not looking for a commuting vehicle. They were looking for a competition instrument. The AJS 18CS, a 500cc overhead valve scrambler specifically stripped of lighting and heavy road equipment, became the premier weapon of choice for the American off-road racer. It featured an all-aluminum alloy cylinder head, replacing the heavier iron components of earlier years, which allowed the engine to shed heat rapidly during brutal, hour-long desert races. For the American rider pushing an engine to its thermal limits under the California sun, this metallurgical upgrade was the difference between finishing a race and seizing a piston, a catastrophic failure where extreme heat causes the piston to expand and lock solid inside the cylinder, destroying the engine instantly. The physical presence of AJS at the starting line of major American races reached its peak during this era. At the grueling Catalina Grand Prix, an island race that forced riders to navigate steep dirt fire roads, paved coastal streets, and deep loose sand, the AJS 500C singles were relentless. The torque delivery of the long-stroke engine, a design where the piston travels a relatively long distance up and down the cylinder, prioritizing low-end pulling power over high RPM speed, allowed riders to find mechanical traction on unpredictable surfaces. While domestic V-twins struggled with their sheer mass, and early two-stroke engines that complete a power cycle in two piston strokes, producing frantic, high-revving power, often overheated or fouled their spark plugs, the AJS four-stroke single maintained a steady, hammer-like rhythm. This was the cultural and commercial peak of the brand in America. AJS was no longer just a foreign curiosity, it was an established baseline for handling and durability. Independent parts counters, stocked British Whitworth hardware, and specialized mechanics learned the exact tolerances of the Amal carburetors and Lucas magnetos, a self-contained electrical generator that provided spark to the engine without relying on a battery. In these American service bays, the British motorcycle was understood, supported, and perfected for the dirt. On the smooth dirt ovals of Ascot Park and the paved road courses across the country, the specialized AJS 7R Boy Racer achieved a legendary status among American privateers. A privateer was an independent racer funding their own program without the massive financial backing of a factory race team. For these riders, the AJS 7R was a revelation. Buying one required a substantial financial commitment, often exceeding $2,000 at a time, when a standard working-class motorcycle cost half that amount. But the crates arriving from the Plumstead factory contained a machine that could win a national-level race on its first weekend out of the box. In a privateer racer's hands, the machine did not merely represent weekend recreation, it represented whether an independent mechanic could challenge the world's largest factories and survive the American dirt on their own terms. The 7R frame geometry, the specific angles and measurements of the steel structure holding the wheels in alignment, was so perfectly balanced that American riders claimed the motorcycle practically steered itself through high-speed corners. The handling inspired absolute trust. A rider could brake later, lean harder, and open the throttle earlier than they ever could on a heavy domestic machine. The AJS badge had conquered the American racing landscape, and the dealerships were selling every 18CS and 7R they could import. The system of British manufacturing, independent American distribution, and privateer racing seemed perfectly aligned. The brand looked invincible on the racetrack at the exact moment its structural weaknesses were being quietly exposed in the showroom. The physical presence of AJS in America reached its absolute zenith in the early 1960s. At local dirt tracks across the country, from the clay ovals of the Midwest to the sprawling scrambles of the Mojave Desert, the distinct exhaust note of a British single-cylinder engine became the baseline of American off-road competition. Dealerships that had taken a risk on independent distribution networks a decade earlier were now anchoring their entire financial survival around the imported machines. Inside a typical California speed shop during this era, the AJS footprint was not just visible on the showroom floor, it dominated the service bay. Mechanics were constantly rebuilding the top ends of 500cc engines, replacing piston rings and setting valve clearances for privateer racers who demanded maximum horsepower, a measure of how quickly an engine can perform work, for the Sunday main event. The parts counter was heavily stocked with specialized British hardware, gaskets, primary drive chains, and Amal carburetor float bowls, the small fuel reservoirs inside the carburetors that maintained a usable fuel level, moved steadily from the shelves into the hands of American riders. This entire ecosystem relied on a delicate agreement between the Plumstead factory in London and the American dealership. The factory provided raw mechanical capability, and the American mechanic provided the labor and the tuning to keep the machine competitive. In that moment, an AJS motorcycle was not merely a recreational object. It was the difference between an independent rider proving their skill on a national stage and being left entirely out of the competition. If this machine disappeared from the American market, riders would not simply lose a painted badge. They would lose a specific system of mechanical honesty, privateer racing access, and dealer trust that working-class racers had built their weekends around. For a brief period, the scale of that trust was immense. Catalog companies dedicated entire sections to aftermarket upgrades for the British singles. High-compression pistons, aggressive camshafts, and modified exhaust systems were manufactured by American speed equipment companies specifically for AJS engines. Starting an AJS 500cc single required a precise physical ritual. The rider had to retard the ignition timing, find top dead center on the compression stroke, and drive the kickstarter, a heavy foot-operated lever used to turn the engine, downward with their entire body weight. When the engine fired, it settled into a heavy, rhythmic idle that vibrated through the steel frame. It was a machine that demanded skill, strength, and mechanical sympathy. For years, the American market respected that demand. Yet the sheer scale of this success masked a growing logistical strain. The corporate strategy of badge engineering meant that American dealerships were often forced to stock nearly identical AJS and matchless motorcycles, splitting marketing resources and confusing new buyers. Furthermore, the massive American footprint required an equally massive supply chain to sustain it. A high-performance racing machine thrives on constant maintenance, and a dealership survives only if the factory can reliably ship the parts required to keep those machines moving. At the peak of its American influence, it became Synchrony Ersts en Font. The AJS network was operating at maximum capacity, entirely dependent on a parent company across the Atlantic that was quietly bleeding capital. The brand looked invincible in the desert, and on the dirt track at the exact moment its internal structure began to fracture. The motorcycle was perfectly tuned. The business model was already failing. The long decline of associated motorcycles in the United States did not begin with a catastrophic factory closure or a sudden declaration of bankruptcy. It began with the first small crack, and that crack did not appear in London. It appeared on the floor of a sunlit Southern California dealership. in the form of a stained piece of cardboard placed carefully beneath a brand new AJS engine. For years, American riders had accepted a certain level of mechanical compromise in exchange for the sheer performance of the British singles. An engine that leaked a small amount of oil was considered a normal characteristic of high-performance racing machinery. A heavy kickstarter was accepted as a barrier to entry that only serious riders crossed. But in the early 1960s, the American consumer market was changing, and the third major force of the American motorcycle market, reliability, performance, and foreign competition, began to systematically dismantle the British Empire. The threat did not come from Milwaukee or Springfield, it came from Japan. When companies like Honda and Yamaha began expanding their American dealership networks, they did not immediately attempt to build heavy cruisers or massive 500cc dirt track racers. They introduced lightweight, precision-engineered motorcycles like the 1961 Honda CB77 Superhawk. The Superhawk was a 305cc parallel twin engine, a two-cylinder engine with both cylinders standing side by side. It did not possess the deep, low-end torque of an AJS 500, but it introduced a technological baseline that made the British single instantly feel like a relic of a previous era. The Japanese engine cases were horizontally split. The metal halves of the engine block were joined side to side rather than up and down, and sealed with precise modern gaskets. They did not leak oil onto the showroom floor. The Japanese engines utilized an overhead cam design that allowed them to rev smoothly to 9,000 RPM without vibrating the rider's hands numb. But most importantly, the new Japanese machines featured an electric starter. An electric starter, a battery-powered electric motor that turns the engine when the rider presses a button, completely changed the dealership dynamic. An American salesman no longer had to take a prospective buyer out to the parking lot, teach them how to find top dead center on a compression stroke, and watch them struggle to kickstart a heavy single. With the Japanese machine, the customer simply pressed their thumb against a button and the engine hummed to life. The AJS models sitting on the exact same American showroom floors suddenly required a difficult defense. The British machines still utilized vertically split crankcases, which were notorious for weeping oil under pressure. The electrical systems supplied by the British firm Joseph Lucas were heavily criticized by American riders. The Lucas magnetos and dynamos, the mechanical components responsible for generating spark and charging the battery, frequently suffered from internal shorts and failures when exposed to the intense heat and dust of the American off-road environment. If a rider took an AJS deep into the Mojave Desert and the Lucas electrical system failed, the motorcycle became a 350-pound piece of dead iron miles from the nearest paved road. As the 1960s progressed, a new demographic of American riders entered the market. They were not hardened military veterans or professional mechanics looking to build a dirt track racer. They were suburban commuters, college students, and weekend recreational riders. This new buyer did not want to spend their Saturday morning adjusting the valve clearances or synchronizing an Amal carburetor. They wanted to turn a key, press a button, and ride. Honda offered this exact experience for less than $600, while a new AJS or matchless single often cost significantly more and demanded constant mechanical vigilance. This technological gap triggered the second force of the American market: distribution and service failure. Independent American dealerships were fundamentally small businesses. Their survival depended on moving inventory quickly and minimizing unpaid warranty work. As Japanese imports flooded the market, American dealers realized that selling a Honda meant a quick transaction and a satisfied customer who rarely returned with mechanical failures. Selling an AJS increasingly meant dealing with frustrated riders, ordering replacement electrical parts, and tying up service bays with warranty claims that the Plumstead factory was slow to reimburse. The economic reality of the service department forced a physical change in the showroom. Dealerships that had once placed the black and gold AJS 18CS front and center began moving the British singles to the back of the room, giving the prime window space to brightly painted Japanese twins. When an American customer walked in, the salesman no longer pushed the heritage of the Isle of Man tourist trophy. They pointed to the leak-free engine and the electric starter near the door. The independent distribution networks, which had fought so hard to bring AJS to America, suddenly found themselves sitting on aging inventory. The crates of British motorcycles arriving at ports in California and New York were no longer selling out in weeks. They sat in warehouses, gathering dust, waiting for a hardcore racer who might never arrive. The motorcycle was still fast. The business of selling it was becoming impossible. The contrast was brutal. While Southern California dealerships bathed in sunlight and pushed bright electric start Japanese twins out the door, the Associated Motorcycles factory on Plumstead Road in London was operating in an atmosphere of industrial dread. The first American market force, manufacturing, engines, labor, and supply chain costs, was quietly crushing the company from the inside. AMC had relied on the badge engineering strategy for far too long, selling the exact same motorcycle under both the AJS and Matchless names had artificially inflated their showroom presence in America, but it had not generated the capital required to develop a modern powertrain. The tooling inside the Plumstead factory was aging. Developing a new multi-cylinder engine with horizontally split cases and a reliable electric starter would have required a massive financial investment that AMC simply did not possess. Instead of innovating, the corporate board forced the factory to keep building the same heavy, vertically split singles, attempting to extract the last remaining profit from a design that belonged to a previous decade. By 1965, the financial strain became impossible to hide. The American orders, which had once sustained the Plumstead assembly lines, slowed to a trickle. Independent American distributors, watching their own profit margins vanish as Japanese imports captured the youth market, stopped requesting large shipments of AJS motorcycles. When the production line slows, the entire supply chain fractures. In 1966, the system finally broke. Associated Motorcycles collapsed into bankruptcy. The shockwave hit the American market instantly. When the financial receivers took control of AMC in London, all outbound shipments stopped. For an American dealer who had built their livelihood around the AJS badge, the bankruptcy was not just a corporate headline. It was a localized disaster. Crates of essential replacement parts, engine gaskets, piston rings, transmission gears, and Lucas electrical components were frozen in British warehouses or held up at American ports in receivership. An AJS owner in Texas or California who needed a simple clutch repair suddenly found that their local service department could no longer source the part. The mechanic standing at the service bench had to turn the rider away. The motorcycle sitting in the American garage was still a magnificent piece of engineering, but without a functioning supply chain, it was effectively paralyzed. The independent dealership network, the very system that had built AJS in America, was forced to abandon the brand simply to survive. They pushed the remaining British singles into the back corners of their showrooms, discounted the prices heavily, and signed franchise agreements with Yamaha, Suzuki, and Honda. However, the AJS name did not die immediately. It was absorbed by a new British conglomerate called Norton Villiers, which attempted one final desperate revival to win back the American off-road market. In the late 1960s, they introduced the AJS Stormer. The Stormer was a radical departure from the heavy four-stroke heritage. It was a lightweight 250cc two-stroke motocross machine. It utilized a Villiers engine, a two-stroke design where the piston completes a power cycle every 2 strokes, producing frantic, immediate acceleration instead of the deep, rhythmic torque of the older 4 strokes. On paper, the Stormer was exactly what the American desert racer wanted. It featured an innovative frame and moved forward rear shocks, a suspension design where the shock absorbers are mounted further up the swing arm to provide more travel and better control over harsh jumps. But the timing was fatally flawed. By the time the AJS Stormer reached American dirt tracks, the Japanese manufacturers had already perfected the lightweight two-stroke. Motorcycles like the Yamaha DT1 had established a completely new baseline for the off-road market. The Japanese machines were cheaper, their dealer networks were robust, and their parts supply was flawless. The Stormer was a brilliant racing machine released into a market that no longer trusted the company building it. An American rider could not justify paying a premium price for a British two-stroke when the Japanese equivalent was sitting down the street, backed by a massive corporate warranty and an endless supply of spare parts. The revival failed to gain commercial traction. The Plumstead factory was completely shut down in 1969, its workforce dismissed, and the remaining AJS manufacturing efforts were scattered and eventually abandoned. The grand American experiment of associated motorcycles was over. The heavy singles that had once conquered the Catalina Grand Prix were now obsolete. The independent distributors who had imported them were gone. The mechanics who had tuned their Amal carburetors were working on Japanese fours. The collapse was total. The catalog changed. The Japanese rivals arrived. The oil leaked. The electrics failed. The London factory stopped. The badge remained. The market moved on. After the Plumstead factory closed, the AJS name did not completely vanish, but it lost all connection to its storied racing heritage. The rights to the AJS badge were purchased, traded, and eventually applied to small displacement, mass-produced commuter motorcycles built in foreign factories far from England. For the American market, this licensed brand, a historic name legally placed on new products by a different manufacturing organization, meant absolutely nothing. The independent American dealership network that had spent a decade building the brand simply dissolved. The small speed shops in Southern California and the Midwest that once proudly displayed the black and gold fuel tanks were forced to pivot to Japanese inventory just to keep their doors open. The mechanics who had specialized in tuning British singles packed away their Whitworth wrenches and transitioned to repairing Honda overhead cam 4s. When the parts supply vanished, owners were left cannibalizing broken machines just to keep one running. The local service counter, once the beating heart of the independent racing scene, became a graveyard of back-ordered components. The corporate entity of Associated Motorcycles had failed entirely. But the motorcycles themselves refused to disappear into the scrapyards. When the American consumer market moved aggressively toward electric start convenience, multi-cylinder smoothness, and plastic fairings, a dedicated subculture of racers, mechanics, and collectors recognized the enduring engineering value of the British singles. Today, the AJS 7R Boy Racer and the 18CS Scramblers are among the most revered machines in the American vintage motorcycle community. At events sanctioned by the American Historic Racing Motorcycle Association, HRMA, these motorcycles are not treated as fragile, static museum displays. They are fiercely campaigned on modern asphalt tracks like Barber Motorsports Park in Alabama and on vintage dirt ovals across the country. A genuine, factory-built AJS 7R in original condition can command auction prices well over $40,000, passing between specialized collectors who understand exactly what those magnesium engine cases represent. The original financial risk taken by a 1950s privateer has become a highly protected piece of industrial art. This survival is not fueled by mere nostalgia. It is mechanical evidence of an era where an independent privateer could buy a world-class racing chassis out of a wooden shipping crate and maintain it entirely with hand tools. The AJS single still matters today because it represents absolute mechanical honesty. There are no diagnostic computers required to find top dead center, and no software updates needed to adjust the fuel mixture. A mechanic can still tear down an Amal carburetor on a workbench and understand exactly how air and fuel are moving. They can still set the points on a Lucas magneto and witness the spark physically arc across the gap. When an American restorer, a mechanic dedicated to returning an old motorcycle toward its earlier mechanical and visual condition, rebuilds an AJS engine today. They are preserving a specific, unforgiving philosophy of motorcycle design. The motorcycle proves that perfect frame geometry, precise steering input, and deep single-cylinder torque do not have an expiration date. It is a machine that still forces the rider to participate in the act of making power. If you travel to Plumstead Road in London today, you will not find the sprawling factory that cast those famous engines. The heavy industrial buildings were demolished decades ago, replaced by modern urban housing developments. The physical geography of AJS manufacturing no longer exists in Britain. Yet, in a bizarre and beautiful twist of industrial endurance, the AJS 7R engine proved so perfectly designed that specialist engineering firms eventually began manufacturing brand new, exact replica parts. An American vintage racer today can essentially build a zero-mile AJS racing engine entirely from scratch, using newly cast components that follow the exact mathematical blueprints drawn in the late 1940s. The parent company died in a messy bankruptcy, but the engine design was so vital, so essential to the history of motorcycle racing, that the aftermarket simply willed it back into production. The fall of associated motorcycles in America serves as a harsh, permanent lesson in industrial economics. A motorcycle company cannot survive purely on past racing prestige if it refuses to evolve its manufacturing base. The British manufacturer built a machine that could conquer the Catalina Grand Prix, but they failed to build a corporate supply chain that could survive at the Japanese invasion. They relied on badge engineering to pad their showroom numbers instead of funding true technological innovation. They asked the American dealer to defend oil leaks, heavy kickstarters, and unreliable electrical systems against a new generation of leak-free, electric start reliability. The AJS motorcycle was brilliant. The corporate system that built it was fatally flawed. The company misunderstood that the American market did not just buy horsepower, it bought the dealer network, the parts availability, and the absolute promise that the machine would start on a cold morning. Ultimately, the motorcycles outlived the empire that created them. The boardroom failed, but the metal endured. In a crowded American vintage racing paddock beneath the Alabama sun, a mechanic checks the safety wire on a massive magnesium brake drum, opens the fuel petcock, and drives a heavy Kickstarter downward. The 350cc single barks to life, settling into the violent, uneven rhythm its makers taught the world to fear, still ready to carry one more rider toward the first turn. See you in the next video.